South Carolina Senator Tim Scott has announced that he will be running for the Republican nomination for president in 2024, throwing his hat into the ring with former President Donald Trump and South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. Here he is kicking off his first rally.
We live in the land of opportunity. We live in the land where it is absolutely possible for a kid raised in poverty, in a single-parent household, in a small apartment, to one day serve in the People's House, and maybe even the White House. This is the greatest nation on God's green earth. Today I'm thinking back to my grandfather, born in 1921 in Sally, South Carolina, in the Deep South. By the time he was in the 3rd grade, he was forced out of school, his education was over, and he was forced to start picking cotton. But my grandfather lived long enough to watch his grandson pick out a seat in Congress.
Former President Trump has already weighed in on the announcement, saying, quote, "Good luck to Senator Tim Scott in entering the Republican presidential primary race. It is rapidly loading up with lots of people, and Tim is a big step up from Ron DeSanctimonious, who is totally unelectable. I got opportunity zones done with Tim, a big deal that has been highly successful. Good luck, Tim." Notably, Elon Musk retweeted Scott's announcement.
So it's officially Trump, Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, and we didn't mention, but should, Vivek Ramaswamy, independent businessman, also running for the nomination. So Trump and Ron DeSantis expected to eventually get in. Trump using the opportunity of Tim Scott entering to say nice things about Tim Scott and bash Ron DeSantis, I think shows you strategically what is going on here. I think Tim Scott, very much like Nikki Haley, is running for the vice presidential slot. Unlike Nikki Haley, I think he is a plausible vice presidential pick for, honestly, either Trump or DeSantis or whoever gets the nomination. I should note, Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, they're from the same state. Nikki Haley appointed Tim Scott to the Senate to replace outgoing Senator Jim DeMint, who was retiring to become president of the Heritage Foundation. He's not president of the Heritage Foundation currently. That was years and years ago. So she put Tim Scott in that position, and now they're both running. Interesting. So, as I said, Tim Scott could be a vice presidential pick, certainly. There's the diversity aspect of it. He is genuinely seems to be well liked. He has a high. He doesn't have high recognition, I don't think, among Democrats or really anyone, frankly. But he seems to garner high approval with his story, his origin story, which he did come from pretty extreme poverty, did work his way up to being in politics, worked very hard. His parents split when he was young. He lived with his grandparents. His grandfather had a huge impression on him, and he's made his way all along.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's the kind of identity-based narrative building that Democrats have engaged in for a really long time. Historically, voters from across the political spectrum who have working class interests at heart sometimes say, I don't know if your particular rags to riches story is really reflective of how much you as a leader are going to be able to make that outcome more common for so many Americans who, of course, do work very, very hard and struggle their entire lives and never manage to reach that kind of success. And I think that's the question he's going to have to answer for American voters, just like all of the other candidates are going to have to answer it as well.
Yeah,
from a policy perspective, he's a critic of Obamacare, wants to repeal Obamacare. He was a critic of the Afghanistan war withdrawal. He thought it was going to be a boon for al-Qaeda and advocated for staying in the country longer, which is in conflict with some of the anti-war sentiment that is percolating both on the right and the far left, and creating opportunities for candidates like RFK Jr. And so from a policy perspective, I think that story is only going to take him so far, especially since Republican voters tend to be kind of red-pilled on those identity politics narratives.
That's true. Policy-wise, he's a pretty standard issue Republican. I would not say he's particularly in the new populist mold. He's kind of I think he's a more opportunity. He'll use the need to create economic opportunity is something he talks about a lot. So I don't know, but it's interesting. He's a popular figure. He's going to make some kind of impact. Donald Trump welcoming him to the race is very indicative. But honestly, even a Ron DeSantis could pick him. So I think he's got a good shot at being the VP pick, regardless of who's at the top of the ticket. I think it's a hilarious troll.
I think there's something very fitting if the Republican nominee, whomever they are, ends up saying, I have my own black VP, and kind of undercutting Joe Biden's ability and the Democrats' ability to make some of these diversity arguments. I noticed that Tim Scott gave a speech during the RNC in 2020 that was very compelling, and many commentators pointed out that the RNC that year was incredibly diverse and really took head on some of the cultural conversations about police violence, et cetera, in a way that I think was rather adept, was rather tactful and good, and seemed to be signaling a shift in Republican politics to really embracing some of the identity framing that Democrats have been using for a really long time. And Tim Scott was front and center for that project.
Well, another big aspect of his identity is that he is an evangelical Protestant Christian, talks a lot about religious values. If it becomes the case that Donald Trump needs to shore up his support a little bit with the evangelicals, given the kinds of things he's been saying lately about abortion, indicating that he thinks the repeal Roe v. Wade hurt, that maybe some Republicans, including Ron DeSantis, have gone too far. Tim Scott is a faith and freedom kind of Republican. That could help.
Yeah, it says he identifies as pro-life.
He's unmarried. That's interesting.
He's unmarried.
A single guy.
He opposes tax-funded embryonic stem cell research, which used to be a big issue that nobody seems to really care about that much. Opposes assisted suicide and same-sex marriage. I mean, you're right that this is very conservative, typical, bog standard Republican stuff here.
South Carolina has no wives in the Senate because Lindsey Graham is also unmarried. So there's no. So the two. I've never thought of it. It's just interesting. The two senators representing are Republican senators representing South Carolina. No, it's a bro club.
What's going on with the options down in South Carolina on the dating circuit? Anyway, one other thing to note is that part of why Trump might be welcoming Tim Scott with open arms is that polls suggest that he's not very much of a threat at this point. This is from a Newsweek piece from 2 days ago. Trump commands more than 53% of the Republican electorate's support in aggregate polling by 538. DeSantis is the next closest challenger at a shade under 21%. And a hypothetical head-to-head matchup, Trump polls well ahead of Scott with the survey, the Harvard-Harris survey that we've been talking about all day. It shows Trump with a 79-21 advantage over Scott in a two-person contest.
Well, and again, every entrant into the race subtracts not from Trump, but from DeSantis. So now we have, now there were four. We're going to have DeSantis get in probably. Mike Pence has given every indication he is going to get in. Chris Christie has suggested he might get in. You get to, that's 7, you get to 8, 9, 10 candidates. Donald Trump is virtually guaranteed to be renominated.
Yeah, we'll see if the Republicans get it together and, rig the primary the way the Democrats so effectively did, where they put their heads together and said, look, none of us is emerging ahead of Trump. We got to force everyone to drop out and consolidate behind one non-Trump alternative. That's how they were able to defeat Bernie Sanders in 2020. Let's see if the Republicans get their act together, because they definitely declined to do that in 2016. That sounded like I was advocating for that, or get their act together. But to the extent that there are these anti-Trump establishment Republicans, that seems to be the path forward for them.
For sure. More Rising right after this.